I never imagined that while I was away for just 1 week, my beloved Victorian porch, my home's defining feature, would be completely demolished. But as I stood in my driveway, staring at the raw, exposed foundation where it once stood, I realized this wasn't just vandalism. This was personal, and it had Janet Holloway written all over it. Please like and subscribe to the channel so I have the motivation to make more good stories. Thank you for doing that, and I wish you a good day. Ryan Mitchell had always considered Brookhaven Grove to be the perfect neighborhood, quiet, historic, and filled with beautifully preserved homes dating back over a century. 5 years ago, when he found his Victorian-style house with its ornate wraparound porch and detailed woodwork, he knew he had found his forever home. The Homeowners Association, HOA, had always existed, but it was never overly strict, until Janet Holloway took control. Janet Holloway was the newly appointed HOA president, and in just a few short months she had turned what was once a cooperative community into a dictatorship. She rebranded the HOA as the Brookhaven Beautification Initiative and made it her mission to modernize the neighborhood, whether the residents liked it or not. Under her rule, homeowners were suddenly fined for things they had never been cited for before. Mailboxes being the wrong shade of black, garden decorations not conforming to the community aesthetic, and even holiday decorations being taken down too late. Ryan had largely ignored Janet's power trip until now. Ryan had just returned from a week-long business trip overseas. As he pulled into his driveway, exhausted but relieved to be home, his headlights swept over something off. His front porch was gone, not damaged, not partially removed. Gone. All that remained was raw, exposed foundation and a pile of splintered wood dumped in the corner of his yard. For a moment Ryan wondered if he had somehow driven to the wrong house, but the brass numbers, 524 Maple Lane, were still on his front door. This was his house. His heart pounded as he jumped out of his car, his luggage forgotten in the trunk. He ran up the newly placed makeshift wooden steps that someone had hastily installed in place of his porch. Who did this? Why? Still in shock, Ryan bolted inside and immediately checked his home security cameras. He rewound the footage to the beginning of the week and stared in disbelief as the video played out. At 8 a.m., the day after he left for his trip, a construction crew arrived. They methodically tore down the porch, loading every piece of wood into a dumpster. And standing right there, supervising the entire demolition, clipboard in hand, was Janet Holloway herself. She watched with her arms crossed, occasionally stepping forward to point and give instructions as if she had every right to tear down a major structural component of someone else's house. Ryan's hands clenched into fists as he watched the footage. This wasn't just an HOA fine or a warning. This was destruction. This was theft. This was illegal. Ryan stormed outside and rummaged through his mailbox, looking for any kind of warning, any letter, anything that could explain this insanity. And then he found it. A thin white envelope postmarked 3 days ago, after the demolition had already taken place. He ripped it open and read, "Dear Mr. Mitchell, the HOA has determined that your property violates community aesthetic guidelines, specifically regarding non-conforming historical elements. As per our updated regulations, excessive ornamentation and outdated architectural styles are subject to mandatory remediation. Due to noncompliance, the HOA has taken corrective action. Sincerely, Brookhaven Grove HOA President Janet Holloway Ryan couldn't believe what he was reading. Non-conforming historical elements? This entire neighborhood was historical. Mandatory remediation? That was just a fancy way of saying they tore down his porch without his consent. Due to noncompliance, but he was never given a chance to comply. His blood boiled as he realized what had happened. Janet waited until he was gone, sent a notice knowing he wouldn't see it, and then demolished his porch before he could object. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated attack. Ryan's hands were shaking with rage, but he knew storming into Janet's house and screaming at her wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he did what she never expected. He stayed calm and started gathering evidence. He saved the security footage and backed it up to multiple devices. He scanned the letter and documented the postmark date to prove that it had arrived too late for him to respond. He began researching HOA bylaws, city codes, and historic preservation laws. And then he called his lawyer. They did what? His lawyer, Kevin, nearly choked on the other end of the line. They demolished my porch while I was out of town, Ryan said through gritted teeth. And they didn't even bother filing a city permit. This wasn't a citation, it was vandalism. Kevin paused. You said your house is over 100 years old? Yeah. Why? Kevin exhaled sharply. Ryan, if that's true, your house might be a protected historic property. That means they might have just broken more than HOA rules. They might have broken the law. Ryan's eyes widened. That was the moment he knew. Janet Holloway had made a huge mistake, and he was about to make her regret it. Ryan spent the next 24 hours preparing for the battle ahead. He scoured HOA bylaws, highlighting contradictions and violations in Janet's actions. He contacted the Brookhaven Historical Society and requested official documentation confirming whether his porch was a protected landmark. He compiled statements from neighbors who had also been targeted by Janet's excessive rule enforcement. And most importantly, he prepared to confront Janet. Because when someone tears down part of your house without permission, you don't just sit back and let it happen. You fight back. Ryan isn't just looking for an apology. He's out for justice. He knows Janet planned this. He knows she waited until he was out of town. And now he's going to expose her corruption in front of the entire HOA board. But what he doesn't know yet is that Janet has secrets of her own. And this battle, it's only just beginning. Ryan had spent the past 24 hours gathering evidence, researching laws, and preparing for battle. Now it was time to face Janet Holloway directly. But she wasn't alone. Janet wasn't the type to operate in the shadows. She thrived on public displays of authority. So when Ryan arrived at her house, he wasn't surprised to find that she was hosting one of her exclusive HOA meetings. Her home, a massive, modernized colonial-style house, stood in sharp contrast to the historic charm of Brookhaven Grove. Inside, a small group of HOA board members and their loyal followers sat around her pristine, glass-topped dining table, sipping overpriced wine. They all turned and stared when Ryan walked through the open door. "Ah, Mr. Mitchell." Janet's voice was syrupy sweet, but her eyes were as cold as ice. "I was wondering when you'd show up." She didn't look the least bit guilty. She wasn't surprised. She had been expecting him. Ryan crossed his arms, staring her down. "You demolished my porch." His voice was calm, but ice cold with rage. Janet sighed dramatically, shaking her head as if she were dealing with a child. "Ryan, let's not be so dramatic. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove your porch because it didn't comply with the new community aesthetic." Ryan didn't flinch. "The new community aesthetic? That's interesting. Because my house was built over a century ago, the entire neighborhood has the same style." Janet waved a dismissive hand. "And that's exactly the problem. We're trying to modernize Brookhaven Grove. Your porch was outdated, excessive, and frankly, an eyesore. Ryan clenched his jaw. You mean it didn't fit your personal taste? Janet didn't even bother denying it. She just smirked. Ryan took a slow step forward, his voice dangerously low. You sent that notice after I left town. Then you destroyed my porch before I even had a chance to respond. Janet's smug expression flickered, just for a moment, but she recovered too quickly. The board followed standard procedure. She took another sip of her tea. We gave you written notice. It's not our fault you weren't available to comply. Ryan knew she was lying. She had timed everything perfectly to eliminate his ability to fight back. She wanted to force him into submission. Janet set her cup down and leaned forward, clasping her hands together. You should be grateful, Ryan. He laughed bitterly. Grateful? She nodded, her eyes gleaming. The HOA is even covering 20% of the cost to install a brand new porch. A craftsman-style one, of course. Something more appropriate for the new aesthetic. Ryan felt his stomach turn. They weren't just stealing his porch. They were forcing him to pay for the replacement. You think I'm going to just accept this? He said slowly. Janet shrugged, feigning sympathy. You don't have much choice, do you? The room was silent. The other HOA members avoided Ryan's gaze. They knew what was happening, but they were too scared to challenge Janet. Ryan realized then, this wasn't the first time she had done this. Ryan took a step closer, towering over Janet's rigid posture. I never approved this. You had no legal right to touch my property. Janet laughed softly, shaking her head. The decision has been made. You can fight it, but, well, you know how these things go. She tilted her head. HOAs always win. Ryan let the words sink in. She was so sure she had total control, but Janet had underestimated him. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to the security footage of her personally overseeing the demolition. Then, without breaking eye contact, he hit play. Her eyes darkened. The other HOA members shifted uncomfortably as they watched the screen. Ryan saw the flicker of panic in Janet's face. And that's when he knew. He had her. I hope you enjoyed your little power trip, Janet, Ryan said, his voice low and steady, because it's about to end. He turned on his heel and walked out. As he left, Janet called after him. Do what you want, Ryan. You won't win. But her voice wasn't as confident as before. Ryan didn't go straight home. Instead, he walked across the street to Frank Harrison's house. Frank was a 74-year-old retired history teacher who had lived in Brookhaven Grove for nearly 40 years. He had seen HOA presidents come and go, but Janet was different. When Frank opened the door, he didn't even need to ask why Ryan was there. You're here about Janet, he said. Ryan nodded. She destroyed my porch. Frank sighed. She's done it before. Ryan's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Frank motioned for him to come inside. As they sat in his cluttered but cozy living room, Frank poured 2 glasses of whiskey. Then he told Ryan everything. Janet had forced multiple homeowners to tear down or alter their properties under the guise of beautification. Anyone who fought back was suddenly hit with fines, citations, and mysterious HOA violations. She had filled the board with her loyalists, making sure every vote was unanimous in her favor. And 2 years ago, she had even forced an elderly woman to remove her wheelchair ramp because it ruined the aesthetic. Ryan felt sick. She's bullying people into submission, Ryan muttered. Frank nodded gravely. And if you don't stop her, she's going to do it again. Ryan's jaw clenched. He had come here looking for answers, but he had found a mission. This wasn't just about his porch anymore. This was about stopping Janet before she ruined more lives. Ryan downed his whiskey. Then he stood up, his eyes burning with determination. It's time to bring her down. Ryan had spent the entire night going through the HOA bylaws, city ordinances, and every legal document he could find regarding property rights. What he discovered made his blood boil. Janet never had the legal authority to demolish his porch, not without city permits. The notice she sent him was invalid. HOA rules couldn't override historic property protections. Brookhaven Grove wasn't just any neighborhood. It was designated as a historic district, meaning significant modifications required city approval. And the biggest revelation, Ryan's home was a protected landmark. His Victorian-style porch wasn't just part of his house. It was part of the city's history, and Janet had illegally destroyed it. She had broken the law. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. She really screwed up this time. At 8 a.m. sharp, Ryan marched into Brookhaven City Hall. He went straight to the building permits office where a tired-looking clerk named Lisa Turner sat behind the desk. "Hi," Ryan said, setting his hands on the counter. "I need to check if any demolition permits were filed for my property." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Address: 8824 Maplewood Lane." She typed it in and frowned. There's nothing here." Ryan's stomach tightened. "Are you sure? My porch was torn down last week under an HOA order." Lisa sighed and turned the screen around. "I'm sure. If a permit had been filed, it would be listed right here. And let me tell you, no matter what your HOA says, they don't have the authority to demolish structures without proper approval." Ryan exhaled slowly. Got her. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the screen. "Thanks, Lisa. That's all I needed." Janet had just committed a massive violation. Now Ryan needed more. Ryan's next stop was the Brookhaven Historical Society. He walked through the ornate oak doors, greeted by an elderly man named Mr. Holloway. Ryan didn't miss the irony. "Hi, I'm looking for information on my house," Ryan said. "It's a Victorian-style home in Brookhaven Grove. Address is 8824 Maplewood Lane." Mr. Holloway's face lit up. "Oh, that home is one of our landmark properties. Beautiful porch, intricate woodwork. They don't make them like that anymore." Ryan's chest tightened. "Yeah, they really don't." "So," Ryan asked carefully, "if someone were to, say, demolish that porch without approval, would that be a problem?" Mr. Holloway's smile vanished. "That would be highly illegal. The city's preservation laws prohibit altering or removing historically significant structures without a full review process." Ryan pulled out his phone, scrolling to the pictures of his destroyed porch. He placed it on the table. "It's gone," he said flatly. "The HOA tore it down while I was out of town." Mr. Holloway's eyes widened. "Oh, my word." He snatched up a pen and immediately started writing. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "If this was done without city approval, you have legal grounds to file a formal complaint. The city can issue fines, order them to restore the property, possibly even pursue criminal charges depending on the circumstances." Ryan nodded. "That's exactly what I plan to do." Ryan had enough proof to take Janet down, but there was still one unanswered question. Why? Why was she so obsessed with controlling renovations? What was in it for her? Ryan decided to check the HOA financial records. By law, homeowners had the right to request a copy. So, that afternoon, he walked into the Brookhaven HOA office and made his request. Janet's right-hand man, Paul Dixon, looked nervous as he handed over the files. Ryan sat down and started reading. What he found made his stomach turn. The HOA had spent $46,000 in the past year on neighborhood improvements. Nearly half of that money went to a single construction company, Holloway Contracting. Ryan did some quick research and discovered that Holloway Contracting was owned by Janet's brother-in-law. It was a scam. Janet was forcing homeowners to make unnecessary renovations. Then she was funneling HOA money into her family's business. This isn't just HOA overreach, Ryan thought. This is fraud. Ryan spent the next 2 days gathering everything he needed. Checkmark proof that Janet had no legal right to demolish his porch. Documents from the Historical Society proving his home was protected. Financial records showing Janet was funneling money to her brother-in-law's company. Testimonies from neighbors who had been forced into similar renovations. Security footage of Janet personally overseeing the demolition. Then he printed copies of every document. On Sunday evening, he went door to door, handing them out. The reaction was immediate. Helen Peterson, an elderly widow, was furious when she learned Janet had overcharged her for a mandatory repainting. Zach Miller, a young homeowner, realized he had been scammed into replacing his roof for no reason. Frank Harrison, the retired teacher, called it the biggest HOA scam I've seen in 40 years. By Monday morning, nearly the entire neighborhood knew the truth, and they wanted blood. Ryan knew Janet would try to talk her way out of it, so he needed to make sure she didn't have the chance. He emailed his lawyer. Then he called a city inspector and invited him to the next HOA meeting. And finally, he made one last call to the local news. Because if Janet thought she could bully people into silence, she was about to learn a very public lesson. The Brookhaven HOA meeting was usually a boring affair. A handful of homeowners showed up, mostly older residents who wanted to discuss lawn maintenance regulations or garbage collection schedules. But tonight, the room was packed. Over 40 residents had shown up. There were whispers and murmurs about Janet's illegal activities. Some homeowners clutched printed copies of the evidence Ryan had handed out earlier. Janet walked in with her usual arrogance, dressed in an expensive blazer, her expression unreadable. She wasn't stupid. She knew something was going on, but she still thought she could control it. She has no idea what's coming, Ryan thought. He sat near the front, his documents neatly organized, his phone ready to record. Because tonight, the truth was coming out. Janet took her seat at the head of the table, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. "All right, let's get started," she said, forcing a smile. "I see we have quite the turnout tonight. That's great. Community engagement is important." Ryan almost laughed. Engagement? No, Janet. People weren't here because they cared about the HOA. They were here because they wanted answers. They were done being bullied. Janet glanced around, sensing the tension, but continued. "First on the agenda, let's discuss some new community beautification initiatives." Ryan raised his hand. Janet's smile faltered. "Yes, Ryan?" Ryan stood up calmly. "I'd like to discuss something before we move forward," he said. "It concerns an HOA violation, one committed by you." The room fell silent. Janet let out a fake laugh. "Ryan, if you have a personal complaint, we can discuss it later." "No," Ryan said firmly. "We're discussing it now. Because I have proof that you've been illegally using your position to abuse homeowners, steal HOA funds, and violate historic preservation laws." Janet's face paled. The room erupted. People turned to each other, whispering. This wasn't just another HOA dispute. This was something bigger, something criminal. Ryan took a deep breath. It was time. He pulled out a stack of printed documents and began. Step 1, the illegal demolition. Ryan held up a still frame from his security footage. The image showed Janet standing on his property, supervising the demolition crew. "This is video footage of Janet personally overseeing the destruction of my porch," Ryan stated. "This happened without my consent. It happened without proper notice, and, most importantly, it happened without a demolition permit." He handed copies of the city records to the HOA board, proving no permit had been filed. The crowd muttered in disbelief. "That's illegal," someone whispered. "Did she really think no one would notice?" another added. Janet cleared her throat. "This is being blown out of proportion," she said. "The HOA board voted to remove the porch because Ryan cut her off." "No, they didn't." Janet froze. Ryan turned to Paul Dixon, Janet's right-hand man. "Paul, can you confirm, was there ever an official vote from the HOA board to approve this demolition?" Paul swallowed hard. I don't recall any vote." The room exploded. "Are you serious?" someone shouted. "She did this on her own?" "Unbelievable." Janet's jaw clenched. She was losing control. But Ryan wasn't done. Ryan handed out a second set of documents. "According to the Brookhaven Historical Society," he continued, "my home is a protected landmark. That means no modifications, especially demolitions, can be made without approval from the city." The historical preservation officer stood up. "That's correct," he confirmed. "This was a serious violation of city law. The HOA has no authority to override historic protections." Janet gripped the table. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "We're just trying to improve the neighborhood." Ryan laughed. "Improve it? By destroying historic homes without approval?" More residents spoke up. "This isn't just about Ryan," one neighbor said. "She's been forcing people to remodel their homes for years." "This is out of control," another added. Janet's support was crumbling, and Ryan had one final blow left. Ryan held up the final document. It was the smoking gun. "This is an HOA financial report," he said. "Over $40,000 has been spent on neighborhood improvements. Half of that money went to one construction company, Holloway Contracting." "And guess who owns Holloway Contracting?" Ryan asked. "Janet's brother-in-law." The room erupted. "She's stealing from us." "This is corruption." Janet shook her head rapidly. "This is a coincidence," she stammered. "There was a bidding process." "No," Ryan said, "there wasn't." He turned to the HOA treasurer. "Paul, can you confirm, was there ever a competitive bid for these contracts?" Paul looked like he wanted to sink into his chair. "No," he admitted. "The contracts were just assigned." Janet was done. She knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. Just when things couldn't get worse for Janet, Frank, the elderly neighbor, stood up. And he had the last piece of the puzzle. "I did some digging," Frank said. "This isn't the first time Janet's done this." He pulled out a printed news article. Before moving here, Janet was the HOA president in her previous neighborhood. She was forced to resign after an investigation into financial misconduct. Janet's face turned ghost white. The room exploded in outrage. One of the HOA board members stood up. "We need to vote," she said firmly, "effective immediately." The motion was put forward. Remove Janet from the HOA presidency. The vote was unanimous. Janet was out. She shot to her feet, her face red with fury. "You'll regret this," she screamed. "You people have no idea how much I've done for this neighborhood." Ryan leaned back in his chair, smiling. "Oh, we know exactly what you've done," he said. "That's why you're leaving." Janet grabbed her bag and stormed out. She never came back. The HOA board was about to make history. For years, Janet had controlled everything. She decided what homes should look like. She enforced ridiculous fines. She bullied homeowners into submission. But tonight, That was about to end. After Ryan had exposed her corruption, the HOA board had one final decision to make. Would they remove Janet Holloway as president? The room was silent. Homeowners were on the edge of their seats. Janet sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, her face a mask of forced confidence. But Ryan could see it. She was nervous. She knew what was coming. The HOA vice president, Carol Tanner, cleared her throat. "All right," she said. "The motion on the table. Remove Janet Holloway as HOA president, effective immediately." She glanced around. "All in favor?" Ryan raised his hand immediately. Then Frank. Then Paul. Then half the room. Within seconds, every single hand went up. It was unanimous. Janet was out. Janet's face turned red. For a brief second, she just sat there, stunned. Then she shot to her feet. "This is a joke," she shouted. She turned to the board members, eyes blazing. "You're making a huge mistake. You think this neighborhood can function without me? You think you can run things better?" Nobody answered, because for the first time, nobody was afraid of her anymore. Janet wasn't just being removed from power. Her entire empire was about to crumble. Ryan leaned forward. "By the way, Janet, you might want to get a lawyer." Her eyes narrowed. Ryan pulled out a new document. It was from the city's legal department. An official investigation had been opened against Janet for unauthorized demolition of a historic property, misuse of HOA funds for personal financial gain, falsifying HOA records to approve construction contracts. The room exploded in whispers. Frank stood up, holding out a printed email. "City officials have already reviewed your financial records, Janet," he said. "They found over $40,000 in questionable transactions, including money funneled to your brother-in-law's construction company." Janet's face drained of color. That's a lie," she stammered. Ryan held up his phone. "Actually, it's all right here," he said. "I even called the construction company myself. They admitted that all their HOA contracts were given without a bidding process." More gas from the crowd. "That's fraud," someone whispered. "She stole from us," another person muttered. Ryan turned back to Janet. "And guess what? The city is pressing charges. You're under criminal investigation." Janet grabbed her bag, shaking with rage. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You're going to regret this." Ryan smirked. "No, Janet, for the first time, you're the one who has to face the consequences." She spun on her heel and stormed toward the exit. Nobody stopped her. Nobody looked afraid. Because for the first time, the neighborhood was free. With Janet gone, the HOA board had a new priority: fixing the damage she caused. They immediately voted to review and repeal all unfair fines issued under Janet's rule. Audit past HOA financial records for further misconduct. Hold a special election for a new, transparent board. A special committee was formed to prevent another power-hungry leader from ever taking control again. For the first time in years, the HOA was working for the people, not against them. A few days later, a "for sale" sign appeared in Janet's front yard. She was leaving. She had no power, no reputation, and no allies left. Ryan walked by one last time and saw her standing on her porch. She glared at him. Ryan just smiled. "Good luck in your next neighborhood, Janet," he said. Because one thing was certain: she wouldn't be missed. For the first time in years, Brookhaven Grove felt like a community again. The fear was gone. The homeowners weren't afraid of receiving citations for nonsense infractions. They weren't worried about Janet's ridiculous fines. Because Janet Holloway was no longer in charge. And her final punishment, it was just beginning. It started with a sign, a big, bold "for sale" sign planted in Janet's front yard just days after her removal. Nobody was surprised. She had lost everything: her position as HOA president, her control over the neighborhood, her reputation, and soon she was going to lose even more. At the next HOA meeting, the board had a new motion: fully restoring Ryan's historic Victorian porch at no cost to him. "We're using HOA funds," the new president announced. Not new money, but the very same budget Janet had been misusing for her own agenda. The vote? Unanimous. For Ryan, it was more than just a porch. It was a symbol, a reminder that no matter how much power someone has, justice always wins in the end. Meanwhile, Janet's problems were just beginning. The city had launched an official investigation. She was charged with multiple violations: unauthorized property demolition of a historic landmark, misuse of HOA funds for personal financial gain, fraudulent contracts awarded to family members, the fines alone, over $50,000. But the worst part? She was facing criminal charges. Her lawyer had tried to negotiate a deal, but the case was too big to ignore. Janet Holloway, once the most feared woman in the neighborhood, was now the one fearing the consequences. With Janet gone, the neighborhood needed a fresh start. That's when Ryan was approached with an offer. Ryan, the new HOA president, said, "We need people who actually care about this community. We want you on the committee." Ryan had never been interested in HOA politics, but after everything he'd seen, he knew one thing: he wouldn't let another Janet take over. He wanted fairness, transparency, and real leadership. So he agreed. And just like that, Brookhaven Grove was headed toward a brighter future. The changes were immediate. The ridiculous fines were revoked. Homeowners had a real say in decisions. HOA meetings weren't about power, but about real improvements. Brookhaven Grove was no longer a neighborhood ruled by fear. It was a real community. Neighbors who once barely spoke now helped each other. People weren't afraid to decorate their homes, plant flowers, or host gatherings, because for the first time in years, they were free. The day Janet officially moved out, the neighborhood gathered to watch. No one said a word. No one waved. No one stopped her. Because the truth was, no one would miss her. As her car pulled away, Frank turned to Ryan. "You know," he said, smirking, "I think this calls for a celebration." Ryan grinned. "Block party?" Frank nodded. "With all the decorations and noise violations Janet used to hate?" Ryan laughed. "Oh, absolutely." Have you ever faced an HOA nightmare like this? What would you do? Share your story in the comments. If you believe in justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Blast off.